Welcome. Before I will continue today, I just wanted to know if anyone has a question from past weeks or about anything that is related to the Bible. This would be a good opportunity. If not, I will just continue. Okay, so last week we focused a lot on the legal part of the Bible, or the major part, the book of Leviticus. And I just want to repeat one thing, and then we will continue because it's really important. The idea in the book of Leviticus, as well as in the other sources that are written by the source that we call it P, the priestly source, is that is it coming from me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
You're echoing.
I am. If you don't mind, just please check everyone that you are muted. When you want to talk, just raise your hand virtually or not, and then we'll talk. But is it okay now? Can you hear me? Just raise your hand or good. So a very important principle in the legal aspect of the Bible is that our sins pollute the land. So when we do bad things, there is some pollution, some spiritual pollution, if you will, that accumulates. And when it gets to a point that is too much, God will kick us out of the land. Okay, God repeats in different places and in different ways the idea that the land, meaning the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, had many tenants before Israel. The reason that they were evicted, and this is a good verb to use, was that their sins rose to a high level that God was not able to tolerate anymore. And Israel are no different than anyone else. If their sins will get to that level, the land will vomit them out the way the land vomited out everyone else. Okay, so part of the reason for us to behave ethically and to follow the covenant or the commandments is for us to retain good relationship with God, but also to stay in the land. There is this very close connection between our ownership of the land and our behavior. One more thing that I did not emphasize enough last week, actually I hardly even mentioned it, but it's important to know. Today, and in other religions even back then, there was a clear distinction between what we would say moral sins and ritual sins, right? So if I steal money from Karen, this is a moral sin, that's a crime. If I make fire on Shabbat, that's a ritual sin, right? That's between me and God. The Torah does not see this distinction. All these violations of moral, of ritual, of ethical, of legal, all these violations upset God and add another layer to the pollution of the land. Okay, so there is really no difference in the Torah between not celebrating a festival correctly and oppressing your employee. Okay, so far so good. Another important principle, and I'll end there because I want to move on. I just have 3 or 4 books to cover today, is that when it comes to the sanctity of human life, the Israelite society was the only one that is known to us that saw all life equal. No matter where you are on the socioeconomic level, what strata you are in, your life is worth the same. And therefore, the only punishment for killing, for murder, is death. In other legal codes, like the Code of Hammurabi, which is quite well known, the principle is different. For example, if an upper class person kills a lower class person, they don't kill the upper class person. The upper class person just pays a fine, compensate the family for the killing. Not in Israel. It's a little bit different when it comes to slave, but except of slaves, and I don't have time to talk about that, life is life. You can be wealthy, you can be poor, you can be part of the leading tribe, like the tribe of Levi, the priestly tribe, it doesn't really matter. So that's what I want to say about Leviticus before I continue. Any other questions or comments or anything? Okay, so let me continue. So the book of Leviticus focuses on legal issues, on rituals, on the temple. And then we continue with the fourth book of the Torah, or the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses, the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers has some legal chapters, but mostly it describes the life of the Israelites in the desert. There are different episodes there. What they have in common, most of them, is that Israelites complain about their difficult life in the desert. They don't have good water, they don't have enough food, they are bored, and then God gets upset, Moses gets upset, God wants to kill them, Moses wants to get rid of them, but ultimately they maintain this balance. This is the book of Numbers that is supposed to cover the 40 years of the Israelites in the desert. The most important saga of these complaints and forgiveness is the story of the spies. God tells Moses, before they are ready to conquer the land of Canaan, that was still during the first year after the Exodus, towards the first year, God tells Moses, you're going to start a military campaign. The thing to do is to send spies to Canaan to gather intelligence and to plan how you're going to conquer the land. Moses takes a representative of each tribe, 12 of them, sends them to Canaan. They come back and they start whining. They say that the land is really beautiful and the fruit are big and juicy. But, and this is the but, the people there are gigantic, they are huge. The cities are fortified. And they use the phrase that we look like grasshoppers in comparison to the indigenous inhabitants of the land of Canaan. And therefore, they tell Moses, we have no chance of conquering the land. And they repeat the same line that they repeat in different ways. Why did you take us out of Egypt? You could have just buried us all in Egypt. Why did you take us out of there only for us to die in a war trying to conquer the land of Canaan? At that point, even after God had forgiven them and Moses was okay, God said to Moses, these people are not ready to enter the promised land. All of them will die in the desert. Only their children, those who were born in the desert, those who did not know slavery in Egypt, those who don't have the mentality of slaves, will be able, more mentally than anything else, will have the mental strength to fight and conquer the land. And therefore, we have these 39 extra years in the desert, right? God was waiting for the entire generation that left Egypt to die, and only their descendants, those who were born free people would go and conquer the land. Just in parentheses, for the sake of accuracy, 2 out of these 10 spies they disagreed with the rest. One of them was Joshua, who will succeed Moses. The other one was Caleb. And they said, yes, it's true, the people are big, the cities are fortified, but we can defeat them. And the people did not listen to Joshua and Caleb. The other important episodes there is that one of these complaints, the people of Israel did not have water or did not have enough water, started whining, and Moses went to God and said, God, what am I going to do with them? God said, talk to the rock and you will have water coming out of the rock. Moses took his staff and struck, oh, maybe, I don't know how he struck a rock, but somehow he did it. And God was really angry, so angry that he told Moses that because of what he did, Moses would not enter the land of Canaan, and like everyone else, he will die in the desert. Okay, this is probably the most dramatic event in the 5 books of Moses. We call it 5 books of Moses. Moses, who worked so hard, had to fight with the Pharaoh, took them out, dealt with all their complaints, was punished for something that we don't even understand. Because all we know, God told him, talk to the rock, he struck the rock. Yeah, he didn't follow God verbatim, but was that such a big sin for him to be punished so severely? God told him, you're not entering the land, and I want you to choose a successor, and this man will be Joshua. But at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, which is the last book, I'll say a few words about it in a minute, we read that Moses goes up Mount Nebo. God invites him there. God shows him the land because Mount Nebo has a beautiful vista, beautiful view of the land of Canaan. Moses sees the land, but cannot cross over to the land. And then he dies, and God, it's a beautiful scene there, God buries him. God attend to his funeral, if you will, and people cry for 30 days. They mourn Moses, and the Torah adds that to this day nobody knows Moses's burial place. The reason probably is to avoid worshiping a grave. Okay, they didn't want Moses's grave to become a site that people will start worship as if it's an idol. Okay, Moses is dead. We remember all the good things that he did, but his grave is just like everyone else's grave. And that's the end of the Torah, or the Pentateuch, if you will. Just a few things about the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is a Greek word that means the second Torah. It's a repetition of the first 4 books, not verbatim, of course, but we repeat, or Moses repeats, a lot of the things, the stories, and even some legal elements from the first 4 books. For example, we have another recitation of the 10 Commandments. We have it in the book of Exodus. We'll have it again in Deuteronomy. I love reading the book of Deuteronomy, especially the same stories that are reported already in previous books, because you see how stories change. The book of Deuteronomy was obviously written by a different author, or probably a group of authors. They're called the Deuteronomistic school. and they have a different view or different version of these stories. But this is the end. The people of Israel, almost all of them died except of Caleb and Joshua. Their children are now ready to enter the promised land under the leadership of Moses' successor, Joshua. I'll pause here for a second and ask if there are any questions, any clarification, any comments, anything. Audrey, just unmute yourself, please.
There we go. How's that? Yes, I did have a question. What are your thoughts, or what is the prevalent thinking about why God didn't let Moses enter the promised land?
I'll give you first the academic answer. So the academic answer is, again, saying academic, it's not that all scholars agree on anything, but many view it as an etiological explanation. And I use this phrase many times. Etiological means that there was a fact that everyone was aware of, and then the Torah had to come up with a story to explain to us why it is, right? Why the place Beth-El is called Beth-El? Because Jacob had this dream of the ladder going up and down, right? The angels going up and down the ladder, and Beth-El means the house of God. So they say that it was well known that one of the important leaders, a really important person, had died on the other side of the Jordan. And they attributed it to Moses. So they all knew that one of the most important people ever didn't make it to Israel, was not buried in Israel. It was buried on the other side, right? On the west bank of the Jordan, and that's why, so they attach it to Moses. I personally believe, and I think that's when I start to mix being a rabbi and trying to read it more in a scholarly way. I think that the message here is that, first of all, everyone, no matter how important you are, has to die. And there are beautiful midrashim, how Moses went to God and said, God, please, I'm not ready. Give me more, give me more. And God said, sorry, even you, Moses, your lifespan is limited. But the other thing that I learned in the past 21 years or so of being a rabbi is that almost every person who dies, and last week I was privileged to officiate at the funeral of a woman who was shy of her 103rd birthday, there is always a feeling that they did not complete what they started. So in her case, she was almost 103 and the family was devastated, right? So for us as outsiders, yeah, 103. And she was in a good shape until almost, right? But nobody ever finishes what we start. And I love it. Because, yeah, we think, you know, one day I'll finish it and then I'll close my eyes and no. Your life is short, your life is long, but there's always this feeling, especially when your life is meaningful, that you could have accomplished much more. That's my feeling. And Karen, and then Toby. Just unmute yourself, please.
How old was Moses when he died?
Moses was 120 years old, and that's why we have the phrase in Hebrew, ad 120 till 120. I think until recently, it was 120, sounded like 700. But I don't know if there is a person now who is 120, but I think there is at least, I read a few weeks ago, somebody died at 117, 118, something like that. So all of a sudden, 120 does not sound so miraculous. But later on, when King David died at 70, 70 was considered to be the perfect lifespan. Okay? So, but he was 120. Ages change in the Bible, because Methuselah was some 800 and something, I don't remember. Okay, and Noah was 650 years old. And okay, so they sometimes use these ages just because to close a gap. They wanted to show that there are 400 years between that and that. So they just kept putting numbers. But that was the age of Moses. Toby.
Well, we had a cute story with Alan's mother. She, on her 100th birthday, the family all got together. We had a luncheon in a restaurant. And at the end, I went over to her and I said, well, Mom, you've reached your goal. And she shakes her head. No. I said, what? She says, what then? She says, well, I'll go for the next 50. And she looks at my face and she says, why are you looking like that? And I said, because none of us will be here to help you celebrate. And they all get kidded about that. But that goes along with exactly what you were saying.
Yeah.
And she too was absolutely fine till she closed her eyes, as sharp as one could be.
That's a blessing.
Yes, it is.
Andy? Unmute. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm wondering what happened to Aaron. Did he die, or did he die after he crossed over into Canaan?
No, thank you for this clarification. Both Aaron and Miriam died before Moses.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and we read about it. Aaron died and was mourned by the congregation, and Miriam died, and we don't read about a national mourning.
Yeah.
Probably because she was a woman. It's not so probably. But the Midrash later on writes beautiful things and even finds a connection, because immediately after her death, there was a situation in which the people didn't have water. And the Midrash says that while she was alive, there was a well that traveled with the people of Israel in the desert. And without her, there was no water, and you can explain the water metaphorically in different ways. But Miriam is appreciated. I mean, this Midrash, it's almost 1800 years old. But Miriam is more appreciated today than she was originally. Yeah, that's the nature of the Bible. Audrey.
Sorry, I have just one more really quick question. I couldn't quite tell from the way you described it. Did God choose Joshua, or did Moses choose Joshua?
God.
God chose Joshua.
God chose Joshua.
Was that I'm sorry, was that the first spy story written in literature, do you think?
I cannot answer. I wish my knowledge of all literature from that era was comprehensive. But I know that I saw more hands, and I will take your questions. But it's a really good segue for me to say something, that when we move to the story of Joshua, we see how his life parallels Moses's life in many ways. Because just as, and I'll start with answering your question, Moses sent spies, Joshua did the same thing and sent spies. Just like Moses split the Sea of Reeds, Joshua created a miracle in which the water of the Jordan River just stood up and created dry land. By the way, anyone who has visited the Jordan River would not be so impressed with this miracle, because in many places, one can easily jump from one side to the other, right? Don't envision this tremendously huge. But there are many similarities, because Moses became this prototype of the ideal leader, and to give Joshua the status that he deserves, some of these stories continue. even though the story of Joshua is much more interesting. I have to tell it since I mentioned it. I was about to do it in a few minutes, but so he sent only 2 guys because you learn 12 is a mess. And can you imagine where they went? They went to Jericho and they went to the house of a prostitute. You can say that prostitutes have all the intelligence in the world and they are a great source of knowledge and intel, or you can be more cynical. I don't know, they had the company credit card and decided to take full advantage of it. I don't really know, but that was the version of Joshua. Okay. I think we should continue. So we're done with the book of Deuteronomy. The last thing that we read is the death of Moses. And we read that there was never existed and never will be somebody like Moses, because Moses was able to communicate with God almost face to face in a way that nobody else was able to do that. And if you read some later books like Maimonides and others who focus on prophecy in general, you will see how they distinguish the kind of prophecy, because Moses got his knowledge and communication directly from God while he was awake, and the others, including Abraham and others, got it in a dream or in other ways. But Moses was different than anyone else. And now we are in the book of Joshua, and the people of Israel are about to enter the promised land. The book of Joshua is a very violent book because it describes the people of Israel as a very, very well organized confederacy of 12 tribes with a strong leader, Joshua. They're very efficient. The land of Canaan was inhabited by different peoples, but they destroyed everyone, conquered the whole land, and then had to divide the land among the different tribes. Let me just read a verse from Joshua that is very common here. Thus Joshua conquered the whole country, the hill country, the Negev, the Shephelam, and the slopes with all their kings. He let none escape, but proscribed everyone that breathed, as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Joshua conquered them from Kadesh Barnea to Gaza, all the land of Goshen, and up to Gibeon, and descriptions upon descriptions of how Joshua was able to defeat everyone, and we have the land. The next book, I will say a little bit more about Joshua, but the next book is the book of Judges, that also talks about the early stages of Israel in the land of Canaan. And the book of Judges says, yes, Joshua conquered the entire land of Canaan, and these are the places that Joshua did not conquer. And then we have a huge list of places that Joshua failed to conquer. In other words, the stories that we have in the books of Joshua and Judges and in other books were not written as a comprehensive account of one person, or what you would expect today of a historian, professional historian to write, but they are based on some smaller stories that were put together, and some of them were fiction. Some of them might have been based on some true stories. In the beginning, in the middle of the 19th century, when archaeologists from around the world went to Israel, or Palestine as it was known, until 1948. Almost all these archaeologists were religious Christians. Many of them were clergy. And the way that they conducted their excavations was holding the Bible in one hand and their shovel with the other hand, because for them, the description of the Bible was 100% accurate, and they followed the Bible and identified the different archaeological sites and just saw how perfectly everything matches. That was the big middle of the 19th century. They even called it biblical archaeology. There is still Biblical Archaeology Review, one of the magazines that I personally like. Okay, so for them there was no tension between the Bible and what they found. However, later on, as archaeology developed into a much more scientific field, especially with the carbon-14 test, that enables people to date things very accurately, gaining much more knowledge, we see that there is a huge discrepancy between the biblical stories and what archaeology tells us. For example, the first place that Joshua conquered in the land of Canaan was Jericho. And you may remember, and I think there is a children's song about it, because Jericho was surrounded by a wall, and what the people of Israel had to do, there are two different accounts there. One of them is that 7 priests walked 7 times, blowing the shofar, and the walls crumbled down. Okay, miracle or miracle. There is another version of 13, but that was that's the gist of it. Archaeologists went there and said, wow, the walls of Jericho were down. That's exactly what the book of Joshua tells us. Only that later on, they realized that when Joshua arrived in the land, the walls of Jericho had been down for at least 200 years. In other words, there was no Jericho as an occupied site at the time of Joshua. Okay, and that's a story of many other archaeological sites. So the modern scholars started to ask the question, is the story of conquering the land is accurate? Is that really the way it happened? Remember, the story that we used to think of, that we get from the Bible, the people of Israel started as a family with Abraham and Sarah, grew bigger, emigrated to Egypt because of some famine in Egypt. They spent a long time. They had tons of babies, grew to a big nation, left Egypt, and now as this nation of Israel, they are in Canaan. They were able to defeat all the local inhabitants of Canaan. That's not the story that we see, okay? Before I will give you, I'll tell you what versions we have of the story. One thing, the first time that Israel is mentioned in extra biblical sources, which means sources that are not the Bible, is from 1204 BCE, 1200 BCE, or 3200 years ago. And it's written in what is known as the Merneptah Stela. Stela is a block of stone or granite on which inscribed something. And in this, Merneptah was the pharaoh at that time of Egypt. He was the son of Ramses II, the famous pharaoh of Egypt. So Merneptah was his son, and he was boasting about his military campaign in the area of Canaan there. And he lists the nations that he destroyed. And one of the lines there is quote, and Israel's seed is no more. We know it's not accurate because Israel's seeds still exist even 3,200 years later. But the fact that Merneptah, the Pharaoh of Egypt, that was the most important empire at the time in the area, knew about Israel, means that that was Israel, and Israel was important enough for him to boast that he was able to defeat them. Okay, so the Merneptah stela, and if you want to Google it, you'll see nice pictures of it. And if you can read you will see what I'm talking about. So we know that there was Israel, but we don't really know what Israel was. But most scholars believe that around 1200 BCE, this is the beginning of Israel. But if Israel was not a group of people, of slaves that left Egypt and then conquered the land, because we don't have any evidence of conquering the land, how did Israel start? And I want to mention few theories that are quite prevalent. One is immigration, because we know that around 1200 BCE, it was a time of upheavals all over the area. Even the Trojan War took place at that time. There were wars in Asia Minor, right, in where Turkey is today, as the Hittites took over. We know that Egypt started to weaken. We know that many of the Greek islands, there were so many wars there, people started to immigrate to different places. So one of the theories is, yeah, people just emigrated to Canaan from all over, and that's how Israel started. And indeed, scholars found evidence for new settlements from the 12th century BCE with a big but. The settlements that started on the 12th century have the same archaeological culture, which means the same kind of houses, the same kind of pottery, same kind of all the other findings as the local Canaanites. Because when we know very clearly when the archaeologists find a Philistine site, the Philistines were in the coast, right, from Gaza Strip on the south and up to Ashdod, to Ashkelon, etc. It looks completely different than the archaeological sites of the Canaanites. They were much, much better, much more advanced. In modern English, I know people use the term Philistines as almost like a barbaric person, right? The unsophisticated. The truth is that it was just the opposite, because the Philistines came from the Greek islands, and they were much, much more sophisticated, more knowledgeable than the Canaanites and the Israelites and everyone else. And when you look at the pottery, you see this beautiful pottery, well-decorated Philistine stuff, and the very simple Canaanite. So the immigration explains tiny bit, but not enough. Another theory is a revolt. And it has even some Marxist theories attached to it, meaning some group of Canaanites just revolted against the mainstream Canaanites for different reasons. So if it's a Marxist flavor, they will say that there were the proletarian, the workers who revolted against the bourgeoisie, etc. Or just they revolted and started something new. Or some say it just was a more quiet and gradual emergence of a new people. But all of them, more or less, the core of these people were from Canaan. Now, probably a group of slaves who were able to run away from Egypt and made it to Canaan, joined that group. Probably there were some people who ran away from some Greek islands and Asia Minor and other places that joined that group. But Israel the ancient Israel from 1200 BCE was a Canaanite people who decided to form a new identity, to worship a new God, and most importantly, to argue that they were different. Some scholars believe, and I personally like this interpretation, that the group of slaves that ran away from Egypt and merged with the new people in Canaan had such a compelling story, right? Our Exodus story, that the entire new nation of the Israelites adopted that story as the story of the entire nation. Did they make sense, or you need me to clarify it? It's an important point because soon we're celebrating Passover and people ask, did it really happen? And so the story of the Passover did not happen the way it is described in the Bible, but it's quite plausible that there was a group of slaves who were able to escape from Egypt, and their story, and this group joined the group of people who started the new venture that became Israel, but the story of this group of slaves became the overall story of the new nation of Israel. Do you have any questions or any comments, or you need more clarification? I believe it's David Friedman, so go ahead, David. No, David. Andy?
Well, there were also some slaves that escaped from the Hittite kingdom from the north, may have mingled with the Egyptian slaves.
So scholars today would say, yeah, there were probably some slaves, some other places as part of the revolt, or people who wanted independence.
Yeah, they were sort of like a no man's land. So the Hittites and the Egyptians sort of said, okay, we'll leave that middle territory alone, so we're not always fighting with each other. I don't know.
I don't think so, because the blessing and the curse of this land, as people like to say, in the past 4,000 years, there is no land in the world that has known so many wars as this tiny strip of land that is the size of Rhode Island. And why is that? Because Israel just happened to be located in the middle of the crossroads of the most important empires. So you have Egypt in the south, still you have Egypt in the south. You have the Hittites that you mentioned in the north, right? You have Mesopotamia in the east and northeast. And it was wonderful in times of peace because everyone had to go through Israel. And there were three main roads, one by the sea, Mediterranean Sea, one by the plain, right? And one by the Jordan River, okay? So a lot of commercial opportunities in times of peace. In times of war, all the armies meet there. And Megiddo, for example, is one of the most famous sites because we go there and we see the level of destruction, and we read, not even in our Bible, in extra biblical sources, about the clash of the Egyptians and the Hittites, right? Though the Egyptians from the south, the Hittites from the north, and this is why so many nations controlled Canaan, right? The Egyptians and the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians. Next week, we're going to talk about the book of Purim, right? I mean, this festival of Purim. So the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans, and continue. And last time I checked what's happening in that area, I don't think that peace would be the best way to describe it, okay? So I don't think that there was a lot of quiet there because there was always something there. But it's a good place for people really to emigrate to or to merge. And so it seems like in many ways, it's a little bit similar to the story of the United States.
Melting
Right?
pot.
We all came from everywhere for different reasons and had to build something together. And that's more or less what happened. And you know what? On Thanksgiving, we celebrate if somebody. So in Thanksgiving, we celebrate why the story, like we all came on the Mayflower, but we didn't really. So we celebrate, or the people of Israel had celebrated the Exodus story, even though it was not really the story that everyone experienced personally. So this is the book of Joshua telling us how they conquered different lands. Some of the descriptions are very gory of how they tortured some of the kings and some other things. And then we have the book of Judges ended.
Yeah. Well, which book? Which part of the Bible are these books in?
Thank you. I messed up with that. I should have mentioned it. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. This is the Torah for Jews. This is the Pentateuch. Okay, again, from the number 5. That's the more scholarly name to call it, or the 5 books of Moses. The book of Joshua begins the second part of the Hebrew Bible, the part of the prophets. And we distinguish between 2 parts of prophets in the book of prophets. One of them is the historical narrative that begins with the book of Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. And that will tell us the story of Israel from about 1200 BCE until 586, with the destruction of Israel by the Babylonians, of Judah by the Babylonians, okay? So thank you for this question. So Joshua begins 1200 BCE, the first book of the prophets. The second part of the prophets are books that are named after specific prophets, like Ezekiel and Isaiah and Amos and others, that are not so focused on telling us the history as I'll talk more about them when it will be the right time. So Joshua tells us one version of the story, like a big war, and then we have the book of Judges that continues, that gives us the impression that Joshua was not as successful as the book that is named after him portrays him to be, and gives us a different account. Now, I want to say something about the institution of a judge, or what exactly a judge means. The judges were the leaders of the people of Israel for 200 years, from 1200 BCE to 1000 BCE. Okay, we go backwards, just remember that. Judges did not have only a judicial role, they were the leaders. They often led the tribes in wars. We have 12 of them, but only 6 get enough press. One of them was a woman, Deborah. Okay, so it was not limited only to men. Scholars believe that these judges were, the story we have is based on some folk stories about these very eccentric people. Some of the stories that you know is Samson, right? The one with the super strong person with the long hair, with huge weakness to Philistine women. So even though he knew everything, whenever he saw a Philistine woman, he could not control himself and brought disaster upon him. Jephthah was the son of a prostitute. Ehud, the first one, was an outlaw, okay? But they had the ability to lead not the entire nation of Israel, but a tribe, sometimes a combination of tribes against an enemy. So we have some of these stories, some of them are funny, some of them are interesting. And the tone of the book of Judges is quite clear. God is supporting Israel as long as Israel is doing what is right in the eyes of the Lord. This is the expression that the Bible uses. When Israel does not do what is right in the eyes of the Lord, they lose. They lose, and then their enemies get stronger and defeat them. Okay, so the book is written like a whole chain of events. Israel messes up. The Lord uses one of Israel's enemies. Most of them come from either the east, the Ammonites, the Moabites, or from the west, the Philistines. Defeat them. The people pray to God, repent. God sends one of these judges. The judges defeat the bad guys. We have peace and quiet in the land until Israel messes up again. God punishes them because that's what God does. Another enemy rises and defeats them, etc. So this is what we see a lot in the book of Judges. David, were you raising your hand or not? David Friedman, or I just got the wrong impression? So just unmute yourself, please.
I froze in some way. Okay, there were. The question that I have delves into the overall way in which we might approach biblical study. I'll start out by saying you have shown very admirably that the Bible, Jewish Bible, had a higher level of ethical value when viewed on a historical context to other, comparison to others. But there is another issue in terms of studying Bible, which is, I call it the pick and choose issue. And take the Moses story of breaking the rock. It's very possible and I think useful to come up with a scenario that says, well, everybody has to die. That's a positive thing, but how do you pick and choose the notion that God explicitly said, because you broke the rock, you can't go there?
So when you read the text, God, I want to correct. David, if you can mute.
Yeah.
Yeah, because then God did not say explicitly what was the sin. We know that it was around this scenario of the water and the staff and the rock, but we don't fully understand what was the sin. The Bible does not explicitly say that God was upset because he hit the rock and did not talk to the rock. That's why we have so many commentaries that even go back to if you remember the episode when Moses was young and saw the Egyptian taskmaster striking the Hebrew taskmaster and killed him. So some of the commentators said that was his maiden sin, because how can you execute someone without a trial, etc., right? So this is not picking and choosing. I'm just saying that sometimes we don't fully understand why, and we try to figure it out. And I have only 2-3 more minutes because unfortunately I have a 7 p.m. meeting. And next week I want to spend time on the kings that on Saul, David, Solomon, etc. So just give you the background. For 200 years we have the judges, and that's the time of the emergence of Israel as a people. These 12 tribes of Israel were far from being a unified confederacy. They had their own agendas, they had their own enemies, but they had enemies. And it seems like at the end of around the year of 1000 BCE, the enemies were too strong. And they went to the judge that ruled at that time. His name was Samuel. Samuel was this transitional character. He was a judge, he was a priest, he was a prophet, he was everything in one. and told him, we need a king, because this system, this political system that we have right now is not working for us. The enemies are too strong, we're not doing well. There is a strong tension in the Bible between a voice that is pro-monarchy and a voice that is anti-monarchy. Even in the same authors will tell us that kings are bad, but at the same time, kings are necessary. So when the people came to Samuel and said, Samuel, we want a king, he said to them, are you crazy? That's the worst thing, because first of all, you already have a king. Your king is God, it's Yahweh. So you don't need a flesh and blood king, you have a king. Besides that, if you have a king, then you'll start paying taxes. Your daughters will be bakers and cooks and cleaners. Your sons will be soldiers, and you don't want a king. But they wanted a king. So Samuel went to God and said, God, they want a king. And God said to him, don't take it personally. It's not, Samuel, that they reject you as their leader. They reject me, God, as their God, and they want a flesh and blood king. And then they elected Saul, that I will talk more about next week. But the main reason for Israel to switch from the judge system and a very loose confederacy of tribes to something that is to an entity that is more united and having a much stronger unifier ruler, a king, is the enemies, mainly the Philistines. Okay, these people who came from the Greek islands with sophisticated weapon. Even the Bible talks about their sophisticated weapon in comparison to what the Israelites had. And in order to deal with them, they needed a better political military system. Since I mentioned, and we'll end here, the sophisticated weaponry that they had, 1200 is the beginning of what we call the Iron Age. So we are done with the late Bronze Age, and around 1200 is the beginning of the Iron Age. Now, Iron Age is not like saying 2021, that everyone everywhere in the world is 2021. Iron Age started a little bit differently in different parts of the world. But in the ancient Near East, around 1200 is the beginning of the Iron Age. And that's where we are. So next week, we are going to continue at the year of 1000 DCE with the kings, first Saul, then David. Any comments for the last 25 seconds, or question or anything? Thank you again for joining me, and we'll continue our historical review biblical historical review next week.
Thank you.
And happy.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure, really. Thank you.